is reputed to be connected to Russian intelligence because he was educated in Soviet and post-Soviet era Russia in a school where they trained people who worked as translators for Russian intelligence. So the connection back then was clear. The problem is, and has always been, that's like 20, 25 years ago, and everybody that we worked with back then had some connection or another to the Soviet Union because it was breaking up. But in the meantime, this guy went on from that job to work for 10 years for the International Republican Institute, which is basically a foundation that gets American taxpayer dollars to promote democracy around the world. That was mainly run by Senator John McCain for a number of years. And I think what they're trying to stress here today, the fact that this guy may have worked with the State Department, is another thing that puts the harpoon in the notion that just because he was in a school 20, 25 years ago that was connected to Russian intelligence doesn't mean that today he's a Russian spy.
Which would put the harpoon through the collusion argument. That's the point you're making.
Yeah, if it needs any more harpoons, yes.
All right. We went over this about half an hour ago. I want to get your legal interpretation of this. The judge ruled that Manafort breached his plea deal by lying, correct? And Manafort's pretty much admitted that in his sentencing today.
Right.
Prosecutors have not publicly disclosed why they consider those lies to be important, suggesting they want to protect an open investigation. What does that mean, Andy? How do we interpret the depth of a lie, the degree of a lie, and to what it pertains?
Yeah, the materiality standard for lying in these purposes, Bill, is a very low bar. And the way the cooperation agreements are written, it gives the prosecutor really unilateral power to determine whether somebody's being truthful or not. So it really doesn't tell us a great deal about how important these lies are. The one thing I would stress, having looked at this thing more carefully, is because of the way Mueller charged this case, a lot of this tinkering about the guidelines doesn't make any difference. What Mueller did here was take a money laundering conspiracy, and rather than charge it under the money laundering conspiracy statute, which would have called for a 20-year penalty, he charged it under a catch-all 5-year penalty conspiracy provision. And then with witness tampering, which is also a 20-year penalty, what Mueller also did was charge that, instead of charging it as witness tampering, he charged it as conspiracy to witness tamper, which reduced it down to 5 years. So we're in the rare situation where guidelines sentence, which is the sentence that people normally get rather than what the statutory maximums say, the guideline sentence here far outstrips the two statutes that are before the court for sentencing. So while the guidelines might have called for a sentence in excess of 25 years, the maximum he can get under these statutes is 10 years. So, you know, a lot of these adjustments that we're talking about would be very important if what was driving this sentence was the sentencing guidelines. But here, because of the way Mueller has charged it and capped it at 10 years, it really isn't going to have much impact.
Each of the counts, the two counts, carry a maximum 5-year prison sentence, as you're laying out. So what are the implications overall as we are awaiting the Robert Mueller report? We do not know when that will formally be released. Could be any day, could be any week now. We don't know. Andy, but what at least can today tell us? What are the implications for that?
Well, you know, I still think, Sandra, the most important thing about Manafort's case is that it didn't establish any link, as Brit Hume was saying before, any collusion-type link between the Trump campaign and Russia. And that after all of the investigation that was done, and I think we can all fairly say that Manafort was really the eye of the storm here. He is the one that they most aggressively went after. He is the one identified in the Steele dossier as the nexus between the Trump campaign side of the so-called conspiracy and the Putin side. So they went after him very hard, and the most they could come up with is tax fraud and that he's an agent of Ukraine.
Andy, there is conventional wisdom in Washington suggesting that once the Manafort deal is over and done with, which should happen possibly within the next 30 minutes, and a break right now, they're going to resume court in about 5 minutes based on the guidance we're getting inside the court. Do you think, that, as others do, that the Mueller report could drop as soon as today?
I don't know if it'll be as soon as today. I think it could be as soon as Friday. I don't think Mueller is going to step on the news of Manafort by, issuing the report. And I don't know that the report is that imminent. And even if we knew that, Bill, as we've been pointing out, we don't know kind of what it is. So, we're still dealing with all of these Justice Department provisions which say that you're not supposed to outline publicly the offense against uncharged people, assuming that, as I do, that the president will be uncharged. Mueller's investigation is a counterintelligence investigation, which is classified. So there's all kinds of classified information issues that would counsel against disclosure. So I think there's an awful lot to work out in terms of what the report actually is. According to the regulations, it's only supposed to be a confidential report from the special counsel to the attorney general. And then how much can you disclose being faithful to important Justice Department provisions about protecting uncharged people and classified information.
All right. Andy McCarthy, you're going to stand by for us, and we thank you for that. We know Judge Jackson is taking a break right now and plans to deliver her sentence when she returns. That could be in just the next couple of minutes. She says 11:10, 11:15 Eastern Time.
In the meantime, Mark Thiessen's with us, Washington Post columnist, Fox News contributor, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And Mark, welcome to the program here. We're all on a bit of a wait mode at the moment. What is your sense about what you've been hearing so far today?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very sad case. Paul Manafort is an incredibly talented political operative who chose to use his talents over the years to become very wealthy and work for some very nefarious people, including some pro-Putin Ukrainian officials. But this has nothing to do with Donald Trump or Russia collusion, I think, as Andy correctly pointed out. The fact is that actually in the summer of 2016, when news broke about illegal payments in the newspapers, actually the reason that Donald Trump fired him was because of his work for Ukraine and the things that he had done that predated his time in the Trump campaign. So Trump actually fired him because of the things that he's been indicted and now convicted of. So it's really hard to turn this around and say that this is now some sort of evidence that Trump was engaged in some nefarious activities with Russia. He should have known better than to hire Paul Manafort. I think it was a big lapse of judgment on Donald Trump's part. He was a client. I worked back in 1989, long before he'd started working with Yanukovych. I worked at Black Manafort, Stone and Kelly. It was one of my first jobs in Washington 30 years ago. So I knew Manafort early on in his career, and Trump was a client back then. He knew Paul Manafort, the kind of work he did. He should have known better than to bring him into his campaign and make him the public face and public spokesman of his presidential effort. And quite frankly, Manafort would not be facing sentencing today if he had not raised his head and tried to make a comeback and become the public face of the Trump campaign.
And that's the case.
So it's a sad story all around.
It's the case his attorney made just a moment ago.
Yeah, Kevin Downing was just making the case of this intense media attention that this case has received, noting that but for in his words, a short stint as a campaign manager, Paul Manafort would likely not be here today.
Mark, just in the 30 seconds we have left, what is the play for Bill Barr as the Attorney General? He gets the reports. Maybe he makes it public, maybe he doesn't, maybe he puts aspects of it out. What is the tug of war with DOJ right now in the special counsel, you believe?
Well, I think that Bill Barr has to follow the law. With the politics of it should be irrelevant for him. I mean, the Justice Department should be above the law. So, should be follow the law and be above politics. So if he, quite frankly, it sounds like unless there is evidence of a criminal conspiracy with Russia, the Mueller report actually might be exculpatory for Donald Trump in a lot of ways. Because remember, what this is all supposed to be about is a question of, did Donald Trump engage in a criminal conspiracy with Vladimir Putin and the Russian government to steal the 2016 election? It seems increasingly likely that the Mueller report is not going to provide that kind of evidence, in which case, in many ways, it's a vindication for Donald Trump. because that's what this whole thing is about. Now, if Democrats want to turn around and try and impeach him for something other than conspiracy with Russia, it's going to backfire on them in a big way, which is why Nancy Pelosi is trying to tamp down all this impeachment talk, because not because she wants to protect Donald Trump, but because she wants to protect Democrats, because she knows that it's going to hurt the Democratic Party if they try to do that.
Thank you, Mark. Stand on by, okay?
Thank you, Mark. We are awaiting the final sentencing for President Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort. Judge Amy Berman Jackson will be giving her sentencing for Paul Manafort just a short time from now. We await that. We'll be right back. A judge in Washington, D.C. is about to deliver the final sentencing to Paul Manafort. He faces up to 10 years in prison for 2 counts. He just gave his statement in the courtroom a short time ago saying he was ashamed of what he has done. He takes full responsibility. He wishes he could undo the past. He's upset with himself, and he's asking for compassion in the judge's sentencing. We are awaiting that. Let's bring in Nicole Argenteri, former assistant U.S. attorney. You've been following all this with us this morning. Any moment now, the judge could deliver this sentence. What are your thoughts as we await that?
Well, Judge Jackson at the outset, I think everyone's wondering, in light of the sentence he got before Judge Ellis of 47 months, how is that going to impact the sentence he's going to get here? And one of the most interesting things that Judge Jackson said was that on the conduct that related to the conduct he's already been sentenced on, she was going to give concurrent time. So I think that here she's constrained by a 10-year sentence. She can only give him up to 10 years, and she can make some of that concurrent to the sentence he's already getting, meaning that he wouldn't get any more time. It would run the same. Or she could make it consecutive, meaning he would do more time. Very interesting that the person who asked that the sentence not be any greater than the 47 months was not any of the lawyers in the courtroom. It was Manafort himself. He said, Judge, when he was pleading for leniency in a way that I think he didn't before Judge Ross, he talked about his wife. He said, please don't make me do any more than the 47 months I'm already facing.
On those points, I take full responsibility. I was ashamed. Let me be clear, I accept responsibility for the acts, and on it goes. How much of a difference does that make for a judge?
I think it's different for every judge, but I think certainly most judges would say that that's a real moment in the courtroom. I've done many sentencings, and where a defendant really looks like they're taking responsibility and taking it personally and recognizing what they've done and the impact of what they've done on both, if there are any victims or on their own families. I think that is very important to judges, and I think it does sometimes make a difference. You see here, she's taken a break before coming back with her sentence. Everything that everyone says about her is that she's a very considered, thoughtful, methodic person, and so she's probably just checking off what she's going to do.
As far as further what his lawyer said, Kevin Downing, about we wouldn't be here unless he became Donald Trump's campaign manager.
Well, I think that's something that you really heard Judge Ellis focused on. The fact that the special counsel was building this case by putting pressure on Manafort to flip, right? But if you think about how enterprises, right, whether they're gang enterprises or organized crime enterprises, which is my background, are prosecuted, you sort of work your way up, right? Like you build a case against one person, they flip, and you move your way up the chain. And I think here they sort of did that with you can see that that's sort of what the special counsel has been doing. And certainly, I think that there's some truth to what Manafort's lawyer said.
If that is the case and that's the pattern, have they reached a dead end? Or have they reached the end, perhaps?
I mean, it's hard to say because I think it's really hard to know what's going on. Everyone says we're nearing the end. The report, there's been a lot of news reports about the Mueller report's about to come out. It's, there's a lot of the record even here that's sealed. And they say because of ongoing investigation. So I don't know if it's a dead end.
What do you think about that?
I think that signals that there are other matters going on. I think that if it were totally over and the extent of all the investigations had hit a dead end, maybe there would be some cause to unseal those documents. But because they remain under seal for reasons related to ongoing investigations, it says that there may be other evidence and other people out there
could
that
be or could not be.
Could not,
and
exactly.
And then you would have to ask yourself the depth of that potential crime or non-crime.
True. Yes, absolutely.
We have heard the president, I believe it was last week, that he told reporters that he felt very badly for Manafort, were his exact words. What options does the president have here, particularly if the judge leans towards the heavier side of this sentence and perhaps makes it consecutive rather than concurrent? I mean, he's almost 70 years old. I believe he'll turn 70 next month.
I think the president has said, I think, a number of things, but one of them being that he's not going to consider whether to give any pardons until after, all of this is complete. Certainly, it would be on the table. The president can pardon, individuals convicted of federal crimes. That would certainly be on the table.
Sarah Sanders said the president's made his position on that clear with regard to pardon. He'll make a decision when he is ready.
Right. Right. So she's not ruling it out. It's certainly a possibility, it sounds like.
And that's an interesting angle to discover, because Manafort's lawyers, and we're just trying to piece this all together here, and thank you for all the added information on this, because the judge said that she would be returning to the courtroom to deliver this sentence around 11:10, 11:15. She's taking a little bit longer. We just heard from Paul Manafort himself. He is asking for compassion in this sentencing. Interesting to hear you say that that is a very real moment in the courtroom where the judge hears that. She has taken a break and she will return. And I know Bill just asked you, but the judge certainly just heard a very passionate plea from Paul Manafort before she took that break.
That's true. And, usually it's interesting that these two cases, right, because he actually went to trial before Judge Ellis and received what many people are calling a sort of a lenient sentence. And he pled guilty before Judge Jackson. And sometimes defendants who go to trial, they end up receiving what can be considered a tougher sentence, because instead of the crime being on paper, where they pled guilty, the judge is very familiar with the crime because they've heard from witnesses, they've heard from victims. But here, what Judge Jackson has in front of her was the evidence of the witness tampering that he pled guilty to, trying to impact witness testimony from prison. And that was something that I'm sure she's going to consider in her sentence.
Here are the words from Manafort. I'm remorseful. I know that my family and I will emerge stronger from the suffering. I take responsibility for these actions. He said that repeatedly today. I'll be 70 years old, and I am my wife's primary caregiver. This case has taken everything from me already, my property, my cash, my insurance. Please let my wife and me be together. I ask for compassion in your sentencing. I promise you, if you do, you will not regret it. How does the judge hear that?
I think what the judge hears him saying is, I recognize I made a mistake here. I take responsibility for my mistakes, and I won't, what he's really saying is that I won't do it again, right? Like, I'm not going to do this again going forward.
So here's the judge.
Court is back in session,
Judge
by the way.
Jackson is speaking. Quote, this defendant is not public enemy number one, but he is not a victim either. Now we're starting to read the tea leaves based on the message from the judge's words here, Nicole.
Okay, so the judge is speaking now. Just give us an idea of what's happening in the courtroom now. She's just returned. What sort of timeline do you expect? Will she come right out with the sentence?
So usually she'll speak for a while, and the sentence will be the last thing that she says. How it's gone this morning is, right, they decided the guidelines that would apply. There was some argument over what the different guidelines were, whether he would get acceptance of responsibility because, the judge found that he lied to the special counsel's office and breached his plea agreement. So all of that has been worked out. And now what you hear coming from the bench is the judge making findings that is going to serve as the basis for her sentence, talking about the reasons for the sentence she's about to give.
Thank you, Nicole. Stand by, okay? I think these words are very interesting. The defendant is not public enemy number one. Why does a judge address the courtroom in that way? Catherine Herridge is outside the courthouse now. Back to Catherine. What are you hearing down there, Catherine?
Well, what the judge is doing is she's laying out her arguments, Bill, or her supporting evidence for the sentence that she's about to deliver. Just based on what we've learned so far, what she's saying is that he is not, if you will, a violent criminal who deserves a lengthy incarceration. But she's also saying in this case that he is someone who committed significant crimes, and for that this morning he has taken responsibility. These are crimes that relate to bank fraud, tax fraud, and also foreign lobbying violations that predate the 2016 election. And Manafort also took responsibility for witness tampering in the post-election period. You remember he was out on bail in D.C. and Virginia, and the allegation, which the judge agreed with, is that Paul Manafort attempted to tamper with witnesses, and that was one of the critical issues that blew apart his cooperation agreement with the special counsel. What we've heard, as you mentioned, from Manafort's team is that he is someone who was singled out because his position with the Trump campaign, and he's also someone for whom his entire family relies as a breadwinner. Just for some context, Manafort has either paying or giving back in real estate in excess of $24 million. And the special counsel team in their sentencing memo had sought to have him pay back a further $11 million, which would essentially wipe out his family. I'm just going to go down to my iPhone here 1 second to see if we have a further update from the court, because the main issue here, as you've been discussing with the guests, is whether this will be consecutive or concurrent. So in other words, will the judge in this case have the sentence add on to the 47 months that he got in Virginia, or will they decide that it will run at the same time as this prison sentence? The other point that I just want to make is that we've also had, pardon me, let me just bring this up here. Judge Jackson has just said, quote, the question of whether there was any collusion with Russia was not presented in this case, period. Therefore, it was not resolved by this case. That's an interesting choice of words, because she says that this central allegation of Russia collusion, which was the foundation for the special counsel investigation, was not, in her words, a matter that was answered one way or the other by the court. Her word was it was not resolved. Manafort's team has made the argument that a central part of this case involved a Russian-born political consultant, Konstantin Kilimnik. And what we heard from Kevin Downing, Manafort's lawyer, today is that there is evidence which had, until this time, been under seal, that Kilimnik had worked directly with the State Department in the Ukraine, and that undercuts the idea that he was somehow tied to Russian intelligence.
All right. Very interesting stuff. Catherine Herridge on that breaking news for us, and I want to repeat that because Judge Jackson just said the question here, whether there was any collusion, was not presented in this case, period. Therefore, it was not resolved in this case. And she began, when she returned from the break, to deliver the sentencing by saying this defendant's not public enemy number one, but he is not a victim either. So the sentence has not been delivered. Judge Amy Berman Jackson, can give Manafort up to a maximum of 10 years. And he's going to be sentenced on 2 charges, conspiracy against the U.S. and conspiracy to obstruct justice for attempting to tamper with witnesses. This is round 2. We don't know whether or not the judge will decide on concurrent sentences or one after the other. We await all of that from that D.C. courtroom.
Nicole's with us here. Brett Baer is going to join us in a moment in studio. And Andy McCarthy is still with us, former assistant U.S. attorney, Fox News contributor. I know, Andy, you might be getting some of these emails. I know certainly you're listening to us here as we continue our broadcast. The defendant, not public enemy number one, also addressing the question about collusion, was not before this court. What are you reading between the lines of the words of the judge in the courtroom, Andy?
Well, yeah, I think she wants to stress that she's just going to sentence him on the evidence that came out in the case before her. I also think it's interesting that rather than simply leaving it at, that was not an issue that was before me, she took pains to say that it hasn't been resolved one way or the other, which means that she's not ruling it didn't happen either. So I guess she's tamping down on that side of the argument as well. But I think what she's mainly trying to stress here is she's going to sentence Manafort on the basis of the crimes that were proved, in the sense that he pled guilty to them, and that evidence, and not a potential that he was involved in an espionage conspiracy.
Andy, very interesting to read through. All these reporters in the courtroom are trying to feed back what they are hearing, and we continue to report what we are getting from our reporter inside that courtroom. Others are reporting these words in addition to what we just told you. Judge Amy Berman Jackson was quick to say when she returned that today's sentencing, quote, will not incriminate anyone in the ongoing investigation, and went on to say what we already know on conspiracy, collusion. This was not presented in this case and not resolved in this case, Andy. We're still awaiting the sentencing. It could come in at any second now.
Yeah, Sandra, one thing that judges are always careful to do during sentencing, especially when it's a situation where there's a whole sort of outer layer of uncharged conduct that is hovering over the case, is to try to make the record crystal clear that I'm only sentencing this defendant on the evidence that's before me, not on any innuendo, not on any things that haven't been proved that I haven't made findings on. And she may just be trying to strengthen the record in the event that there's any proceedings on appeal down the road to make it crystal clear that she's not sentencing based on collusion with Russia or any information that's sort of bouncing around.
Andy, you heard our conversation with Nicole here in New York. What is your sense about the level of contrition that he has clearly shown before the judge today in words just in the last 30 minutes?
Yeah, well, I thought Nicole was absolutely right that when a defendant actually expresses contrition and remorse to a judge, and if it's done in a convincing way where the defendant looks you in the eye and convinces you that, look, I've been broken by this, I'm changed by this, that is something that can have real impact. And I thought it was telling, as Nicole said, that the judge, rather than impose sentence there and then, decided to sort of take a break and gather herself, go into chambers and decide what she wanted to do.
All right, Andy McCarthy,
Thank you,
if you
Andy.
could stand by for us. Bring in the big guns here. Let's bring in Brett Baer, chief political anchor and anchor of Special Report. Here he is live in studio.
See you,
How are
sir.
you?
Wonderful to have you here, Brett. We are waiting. The sentencing could come out at any second now. In anticipation of that, the judge has been speaking. What are your thoughts so far?
One, that this judge, like the previous judge, makes clear, as Andy points out, that this is not about Russia collusion. This is a different case, and they stipulate that up front. Two, this is a different Manafort. In this case, this is a far more contrite, apologetic. He was not like that in the last sentencing, and he was criticized roundly because he didn't apologize, yet the judge gave him 47 months, and that was criticized across the legal community and the pundits. I think it'll be interesting to see whether this is concurrent or consecutive sentencing, and where we go from here. Obviously, this week, everybody's on pins and needles in Washington waiting for the Mueller report to drop, and if it is going to drop this week.
I've had, on your program, it's all a parlor game, as you rightly know. What was the logic to suggest, after Manafort's second sentence, that the Mueller report would follow in suit?
There was a lot of thought on Capitol Hill on lawmakers who I think are mostly guessing because the Mueller report, we just don't know the inner workings very well. But there was a lot of thought that once this sentencing was finalized, that it would be the culmination, the wrap-up, tying with a bow, and then if there are indictments, they would come down Friday concurrent with the report. There's some indication that that may not happen. And so we're still in the wait-and-see mode, and we'll wait and see.
Seems like that is the case. So this is the D.C. courthouse. As far as laying out exactly what's happening here, it's interesting to look at social media, Brett, and how many questions I've received about why he's in the courtroom in a wheelchair. And that's not the first time we've seen him in a wheelchair, but he and his legal team have put out statements saying that his health is declining. And he certainly made that case in the courtroom a few moments ago. He said he'll be 70 years old. He's his wife's primary caregiver. This case has taken everything from me, my property, my cash, my insurance. He pled with the judge there to please let my wife and me be together. He asked for compassion in the sentencing, and he promised, and these were his final words, if you do give me that compassion, you will never regret it. I mean, talk about a different Paul Manafort than we saw during the campaign days.
Yeah, I think it's very different. Obviously, he's been through a lot here. Let's not take away from, what the allegations he was facing, what he was convicted on. Pretty serious stuff. 47 months is, for a man that age is a lot, but in the sentencing guidelines, it was very small on that first sentencing. If this is somehow added on exponentially in years, you're talking about, for a guy that age, almost a life sentence. Depending, and that's important.
Nicole's still with us too. I want to bring you back into the conversation, but Kevin Downing, the attorney for Paul Manafort, towering into it. Manafort's a big guy, and Downing is head and shoulders above him. What he said was, but for a short stint on the Trump campaign, Paul Manafort would not be in this courtroom today. That's probably true.
That is probably true. I think I would concede that.
It's probably true. I don't know how persuasive it is. As I said, you know, he did commit these crimes, right? He pled guilty to them. He was convicted. And so, yes, the government might not have focused on him, the individual, if he had not sort of been able to cooperate.
He was the campaign manager for
4
months, I believe.
From March to August.
Nicole, I want to bring this in here. Judge Jackson, this is ongoing from a reporter in the courthouse. Prior to anyone thinking about a special counsel, the DOJ was already looking into this matter, she says. He lied to his own lawyers and then lied to the U.S. government. That first lie was November of 16, before the special counsel. This disregard for facts, this, I'm just going to spin this, and forgive me for reading this the way it's written, our reporter's typing fast. This has continued. The witness tampering is what she was just talking about. She has not issued her sentence yet. She goes on to say the defendant began reaching out to witnesses to remind them that all the work was being done in Europe. He acknowledged it, but he isn't being straight with me about it now. He pled guilty to the crime of conspiracy, in this case to violate the law. Which judicial proceeding? This one. And then she goes on to quote, and Nicole, I'll go to you on this. We should talk. I've made it clear they worked in Europe. He really hasn't accepted responsibility for that offense, she says.
So this is what I was saying before. Normally, a defendant is pled guilty. They're sort of in a better position before the judge because their crimes are really on paper as opposed to going to trial where they're brought to life. And the thing that the judge is focused on is that after he was arrested and after he was facing these 2 indictments, he's pled guilty to this, he attempted to tamper and influence witness testimony. And that is really, it sounds like from the reports coming in from the courthouse, sticking with her. And it would, right? Because he was a defendant, you know, sitting in her courtroom, in a proceeding in her courtroom, trying to affect how witnesses were going to testify. And I think that the fact that she's focused on that, which was not a crime that he was sentenced for before Judge Ellis, means that it's signaling, and it's very hard to tell at this point, that he's going to be sentenced to, you know, jail time on that part.
Brett, I was reflecting on the campaign a moment ago here, and whether it was a period of 4 months or 6 months. I'd have to Google it and try and figure out the exact dates there. Give me a moment on that. How do you think the White House is viewing this right now within the West Wing? I know Sarah Sanders was asked about it yesterday, about the whole pardon issue, and she put it on the back burner. He'll get to that decision if and when that time comes, to borrow a phrase.
The president has weighed in, has been asked about this, has said publicly that he didn't feel Paul Manafort was being treated well, has said that the crimes have nothing to do with collusion, and he, you know, then goes on to his what he normally says, which is there is no collusion, and he has not ruled out a pardon for Manafort, and neither did Sarah Sanders. So as we look at all of this, you know, that is in the back burner as you see what the sentencing is going to be. Clearly, they have not ruled it out, and they're asked about it almost every press briefing, every time the president takes questions.
And will continue to be so. Her words were, he'll make a decision when he is ready.
Yeah, that's basically, we'll see.
We're looking at a live look outside of the courtroom at the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., Nicole. When the judge does deliver the sentence in the courtroom, do you expect the attorneys to come out and talk to reporters and talk to the cameras?
I think probably not the special counsel prosecutors, but definitely I would think the defense lawyers would come out and give their reaction to the sentence. You know, really no reason not to at that point. But I would certainly expect them to make some statements.
What does it tell you that the amount of time that has passed? She walked back into the courtroom, I'd say it was about 15 after, maybe 20 after the hour. We're going on almost 20 minutes now since she walked back into the courtroom. Typical so far?
Not unusual. I think sentencing is the most important, not surprisingly, you know, court appearance for many defendants, for every defendant, right? It's the moment where All of the facts are before the judge, and their fate is going to be determined. And it's also not unusual for a judge to speak for a while about the reasons underlying their sentence. Like, this is where she's going to lay out the record about the things that she considered and the things that she is not going to consider.
Think about this week here. Legally, we had an update on General Flynn yesterday, I do believe, right, about his trial date. I don't know if there was a...
They didn't set one?
No one was set.
It's kind of floating.
You got the Manafort deal now. I think you've got something with Roger Stone tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yeah.
And what is forthcoming in his case?
We don't know. I mean, it hasn't been laid out exactly how this is going to unfold, but they're looking for time there as well.
In this entire orbit, the point is this week is
consequential.
Yeah.
It is. And on the flip side, you have Michael Cohen up on the Hill dealing with the possibility of lying under oath again and the charges that he did. You have, in the bigger picture, the Lisa Page transcript and what came out from all of that, and how that tracks with what the FBI and Jim Comey said under oath. There's a lot of pieces of this puzzle that we're trying to put on together real time.
John Radcliffe is steeped in law. He's a Republican from Texas, and he's hot on the trail of all of that. I think it'll be quite telling once he goes public and tells us what he has found out with regard to Lisa Page and with regard to whether or not they had any evidence in the beginning to order the special prosecutor based on collusion or not. Guys, want to stand by?
Okay.
Stand by. Paul Manafort's sentencing could happen at any moment now. We are awaiting that. He faces 2 charges, possible maximum sentence 10 years. Paul Manafort, the judge, is speaking in the courtroom in D.C. right now. We'll be right back.
About 11:43 East Coast time now. The judge about to deliver the sentence for Paul Manafort. Second time in 1 week he's been before a judge. Different judge this time. Nicole's with us in studio. So is Brett Baer. Catherine Herridge is outside the courthouse. And Andy McCarthy is riding shotgun from his studio as well. Let's bring you back in here, Andy. Trying to piece it together, read between the lines. What is your assessment at the moment?
I think that she's obviously very concerned, if she's gone on for this long, to explain a sentence, which really shouldn't, I don't think it should take much more than a few minutes. She's very concerned that the appellate record shows that exactly what it is that she was sentencing him for, and making clear that she was not taking into account things that were not proved in the case before her. I think the fact that she highlighted the obstructive conduct, the witness tampering, is obviously a bad sign for Manafort. It's a funny thing about federal judges. I noticed it in terrorism cases and all kinds of awful cases. People come into the courtroom, and no matter what they're charged with, the judge is usually open-minded and willing to give them a fair shake. But the minute you start messing around with their proceeding, they get awfully hostile about that. So it's not surprising to me that that particular bit of conduct is something that irks her.
But you do say you're surprised that she's going on this long, Nicole. You were suggesting she could go on an hour.
Yeah, I think, I think it depends on the judge, but I've certainly been in sentencing proceedings that have gone on for an hour, hour and a half. I think especially in a case like this, where Andy's exactly right, she's going to want to make the record of what she's not considering, which she said, Russia collusion, no part in this, and what she is considering. She spent, it sounds like from what the reports in the courtroom, a considerable amount of time on the witness tampering. And I agree with Andy, judges really don't like to see defendants messing around in their proceedings. She sort of moved on to some of, it looks like Manafort's arguments about why he should receive leniency. And she said she understands that his incarceration will have an impact on his family. But then it sounds like she countered it and said, but that's true of all defendants. So
there's also, isn't it true that judges in this situation like to lay down the groundwork? They like to have the transcript so that they know that this is going to go to appeal or potentially go to appeal. So they want to have it all out there. It's being reported that she's saying that the pre-sentence filings stressed the impact on him, and what it meant to him. As far as what was filed in paperwork, but the remorse that he said in the courtroom, she said, was absent, completely absent from what was submitted to this court.
Oh, so she's going to balance that.
So she's going to say, here's what you gave me, paperwork-wise. I understand what you're saying, but
that was all before his verbal.
filings?
Yes, exactly, before his verbal apology.
Outside the courthouse now, Catherine Herridge standing by. Catherine, what do you have from down there?
Yep. My assessment so far is that the judge is laying out the groundwork for what may be a fairly stiff sentence or consecutive, so back-to-back with the 47 months in Virginia. Sort of in layman's terms, what she's saying is that she believes, based on the evidence, that Paul Manafort has been gaming the system his entire career. This was not an isolated incident, that all defendants have a family surrounding them, and that they also pay the price for their decisions. And also, I just want to emphasize again the issue of the witness tampering. Just a little bit more background on that. The witness tampering had to do with outreach by Manafort and this Russian-born business consultant, Konstantin Kalimnik. And it was reaching out to two individuals via phone calls and text messages and the use of encrypted apps to emphasize that their work for former president of the Ukraine, who was pro-Russian, was very focused on Europe when that was apparently not the case. So shaping the testimony of this witness was the allegation, sort of the foundational piece of the witness tampering. But the judge seems to be very methodical in making her argument, which sort of counterbalances what we heard from Manafort and his legal team.
If we give you a second to look down, Catherine, you'll see the latest from our reporter in the courtroom, quoting the judge, quoting Manafort's defense, Kevin Downey, saying that but for the special counsel, he wouldn't have been charged, and that argument falls flat. She says, saying I'm sorry,
that's very significant.
I got caught is not an effective plea for leniency, Catherine.
That's right. So the judge is saying put the special counsel to one side. When you look at the evidence that was before us here in Washington and then also Virginia, these are just, out and out crimes that relate to tax fraud, bank fraud, hiding money. And the judge said earlier that this was a gaming of the system that Manafort had done over many, many years. She said there was no reasonable explanation for a pattern of deception and that he had huge amounts of money. He had so many homes he could never live in them, and more suits than any man could also wear. So it goes to the idea that you don't get a special exception because you've been put under the microscope by the special counsel. The law in this case is very clear on what the fallout is for bank, tax fraud, and these financial and foreign lobbying crimes.
Very interesting, Catherine. Thank you for that. To everyone, stand on by. We're going to squeeze in a quick break here. Still waiting on the sentencing here. But for the special counsel, he would not have been charged. That argument falls flat. That's the latest word from the judge inside the courtroom. Back in a moment.
Still no sentencing yet. We expect very soon the judge in D.C. to deliver the second sentencing for President Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort. 47 months he received last week from a judge in Virginia. He faces up to 10 years in a courtroom in Washington, D.C. today, facing 2 charges. Let's bring in Bret Baier on studio here in New York City, and Nicole Argenteri joins us as well. All right, Bret. We are still waiting on this sentencing. Yes. And, it comes down to the judge listening to the final words of Paul Manafort, making the case that his health is declining. He was pushed into the courtroom in a wheelchair. Did she make her decision before she heard his final statement or not? We don't know, but it's taken a little while here for her to come out and deliver this.
It is, and I just don't think that the things that we know that she said don't look like it lines up well for Paul Manafort. I mean, Judge Amy Berman Jackson says court is one of those places where facts still matter. A judge doesn't say that unless she's kind of not happy with what is coming before her. She suggested that he lied to her in that court, essentially. And so I wouldn't be surprised if this is a bigger sentence than we think.
We were talking during the commercial about the difference between the two judges this week and last week. Nicole, what is that evaluation?
I mean, I think based on their statements, Judge Ellis during the trial and afterward just seemed very frustrated with the special counsel's office. And I think from people who were in the courtroom, they said you could sort of feel the tension and that he was unhappy sort of with them and with the case. In contrast, I think when you look at what Judge Jackson has been focused on for the last 15 minutes based on the press reports is really Manafort's failure to take responsibility for the crimes. And she's gone through the witness tampering in detail. She's talked about how, the fact that his family is going to be impacted is not something beyond what other defendants are feeling. And she talked about how it sounds like for one or two sentences about how he failed to submit to her a written letter accepting responsibility and how she has defendants who aren't as educated as he is do so. So that must be something that's also bothering her. So it seems that she's really outlining all of Manafort's transgressions.
Here's her quote, saying, "I'm sorry I got caught" is not an effective plea for leniency. It doesn't sound like a judge who's going to cut you a lot of breaks.
Right. And I think she seems somewhat offended by the suggestion that, because the special counsel brought this prosecution, that should somehow count in Manafort's favor and he should get a break for that. I think she's quite soundly rejected that defense.
Judge Jackson saying the defendant is not public enemy number one, but he's not a victim either, Brett. She, early on, when she returned from that break, said the question of whether there was any collusion with Russia was not presented in this case, period. Therefore, it was not resolved by this case. She laid out why no one would be incriminated based on the outcome of this particular case and the charges against Paul Manafort.
I mean, so just let's take a step back and on that issue of collusion. There was a lot of hope in the folks who watched this and wanted this to lead to Paul Manafort flipping and talking about colluding with the Russians, that this was going to be it, that this was going to be the moment. It is not. It's not in this case. It doesn't have to do with anything about this, and the judge made that clear. So did Judge Ellis in the other case. There were people who looked at Michael Cohen's testimony on Capitol Hill that this was the John Dean moment of Watergate, and it was not. In fact, it may have made things harder for folks who were trying to tie things together with the Trump campaign and Russia because of all of the lies that previously he said, and now he's being challenged and alleged now. So when it comes to the issue of collusion or conspiracy or whatever you want to call it, we haven't seen it. And we don't know what we don't know from Mueller. But we haven't seen it, and this case will be interesting in one sense because obviously he committed crimes and he is going to pay the price for them. But it is separate from all
those points are well taken. May of 2017, Mueller's appointed. Now we are a year and 10 months down the road, and a lot of folks are watching today, as they do every day, wondering what's up. And we sit here and we wonder the same thing. What's up? At the end of the day today, do we have any better indication as to what that answer is, as to what is going on here?
In terms of Russia collusion?
All of it.
I think until we see the report and until this is wrapped up, it's really hard to say. I think the special counsel sort of kept a tight lid on things, which makes it hard to comment.
Which is a rare thing in Washington,
yeah.
We should point out. Yeah. I mean, the Supreme Court's pretty good at it, but every place else really stinks at keeping things quiet.
Well, why do you think that is? Is that the way Mueller operates? Does he run a tight ship that way?
I think so. I mean, the leaks have been minimal. I mean, in fact, I can't remember big ones. Mm-hmm. And I think Capitol Hill is horrible at keeping secrets, but Mueller has been pretty good. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Nicole and Brett. Nice to see you in studio in New York City, sir. 6 o'clock tonight, special report.
We'll know what's up by then.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be helpful.
Thank you.
All right. Well, there will certainly be continuing coverage on all of this as the news rolls on. We just heard Paul Manafort in a courtroom awaiting his sentencing, saying he takes full responsibility for his actions. Not to say that I'm sorry for what he is sorry for what he has done, and he's asking for compassion from a judge that is about to sentence him?
Paul Manafort, at the age of 69, has reached yet another moment of truth twice within 1 week, and you'll see it and hear it as soon as it begins. We'll see how long the judge talks. Until then, for Sandra Smith,
That's it for us.
Nicole, and Brett, and everybody else, I'm Bill Hammer. Make it a great afternoon. We'll see you again tomorrow.
Outnumbered starts right now.
Let's pick up the breaking news. We are awaiting sentencing for Paul Manafort as the former Trump campaign chairman reportedly has pleaded for mercy today in a Washington, D.C. federal court. This is Manafort's second and final round of sentencing after he was hit with a 47-month sentence in Virginia court last week for tax and bank fraud. This is Outnumbered you're watching. I'm Harris Faulkner. Here today, Melissa Francis, national security analyst and Fox News contributor Morgan Ortega.